All right, so you're curious about pharmaceutical regulations. I get it, it can seem like a bit of a black box, but it's actually a pretty crucial part of, well, modern medicine. And today, we're going to dive deep into it. We're talking about those guidelines and standards that really shape how drugs are developed, tested, and ultimately get into our hands.
Yeah, when you think about it, it's all about safety.
Yeah.
And not just like, oh, does this drug work? But also like, is it consistently made? Are there any hidden dangers? Is it really what it says it is? It's a whole system designed to protect public health.
So it's more than just making sure a new drug actually does what it's supposed to.
Absolutely. You got it. I mean, think about it. You wouldn't want to take a pill where, one batch is super effective and the next one does nothing, or even worse, has some unexpected side effect.
Right, you want to know that what you're getting is the real deal.
Exactly. And that's where those good manufacturing practices come in, GMP for short. It's all about ensuring that no matter where a drug is made, it's made to the same high standard, the same quality, every single time.
So GMP is one of those big sets of rules that drug companies have to follow.
It's a huge one, yeah. And it's not just GMP. There's a whole web of guidelines and standards. But before we get into the weeds there, maybe we should talk about who's actually setting these rules, right? Like, who's the referee in this whole game?
Yeah, that's a good point. We've been talking about regulations, but who's actually doing the regulating?
So in the U.S., you've got the big one, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. They're the ones who have the final say on whether a drug can be sold here.
Right, the FDA, we hear about them all the time.
Exactly. Then over in Europe, there's the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, and the UK has its own agency, the MHRA. And of course, you can't forget about the WHO, the World Health Organization. They set a lot of international standards that countries try to follow.
It sounds like a pretty complex global network.
Oh, it definitely is. And, on top of those big international players, you also have individual countries with their own national regulatory agencies, NRAs. Like, for example, India has the CDSCO, Japan has the PMDA, and so on.
So all these different agencies, are they all working from the same playbook? Like, are the rules basically the same everywhere?
Well, that's the goal. There's a big push for international harmonization, trying to make the rules as consistent as possible across different countries. But it's definitely a work in progress.
So let's dig a little deeper into some of these key guidelines and standards. We already touched on GMP, good manufacturing practices. What else is there?
Well, there's GCP, good clinical practice. That's all about how clinical trials are conducted, those studies where they test new drugs on people.
So GCP is about making sure those trials are ethical and scientifically sound.
Right. You want to make sure the data is reliable, but you also want to make sure the patients are protected. Then there's GLP, good laboratory practices, which focuses on the quality of all those non-clinical studies, the ones they do before testing on humans.
Ah, so like testing on cells or animals.
Exactly. And then we have the ICH, the International Council for Harmonization. They play a really big role because they develop these technical guidelines for drug registration that are adopted by tons of countries. It's all about quality, safety, efficacy, you name it.
So they're kind of helping to streamline things globally.
Yeah, they're trying to make sure everyone's on the same page, at least when it comes to the science. And then there are pharmacopoeial standards, which are basically like the official quality standards for drugs and their ingredients. Making sure the stuff in those pills is actually what it's supposed to be.
So all these different guidelines and standards, it's kind of like a roadmap for bringing a new drug to market, right?
Exactly. It all starts with drug discovery, right?
Right.
You have scientists in the lab trying to come up with new treatments for diseases. And then before they can even think about testing on humans, they have to do preclinical testing, in vitro studies, testing on animals, all that.
To make sure it's safe, at least in those early stages.
Right. And if everything looks good there, then they can move on to clinical trials, which involve testing on actual people. This is where GCP is really important. There are three main phases to clinical trials: phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3.
So what happens in each phase?
Well, in phase 1, it's all about safety. They give the drug to a small group of healthy volunteers just to see what happens. What are the side effects? How is the drug processed in the body? All that basic stuff.
So very preliminary.
Yeah, very small scale.
Yeah.
Then in phase 2, they start testing the drug on actual patients to see if it actually works and to figure out the right dose.
So that's where they start to get a sense of whether this drug is actually going to be effective.
Exactly. And then phase 3, that's the big one. They test the drug on a much larger group of patients to confirm that it's safe and effective and to gather more data about how well it works and what the long-term side effects might be.
So if a drug makes it through all three phases of clinical trials, does that mean it's ready to go to market?
Well, not quite. If the company thinks they have enough evidence to show that the drug is safe and effective, they have to submit a huge application, either an NDA or a BLA, depending on the type of drug, to a regulatory agency like the FDA or EMA.
And then the agency reviews all that data.
Oh, yeah. They go through everything with a fine-tooth comb. They look at all the preclinical data, the clinical trial data, everything. And they also inspect the manufacturing facilities to make sure they're up to snuff, making sure they're following GMP and all that.
So it's a super thorough process.
It has to be.
Yeah.
And, only if the agency is convinced that the benefits of the drug outweigh the risks and that it meets all those quality standards will they give it the green light, the marketing approval.
Wow. It's amazing how much goes into getting a drug approved. But it doesn't stop there, right?
No, not at all. Even once a drug is on the market, they continue to monitor it, to see if there are any long-term side effects that didn't show up in the trials. That's called post-marketing surveillance, or phase 4.
Yeah.
It's really important because sometimes you don't see those really rare side effects until a drug is being used by a much larger population.
It's like the work never really stops.
It's a continuous process, absolutely. And it's constantly evolving, too, which is one of the biggest challenges. Science is always moving forward, coming up with new types of treatments, new technologies.
Yeah, like gene therapy or personalized medicine. Those are huge new frontiers.
Exactly. So the regulations have to keep pace with all that innovation, which can be really tricky. And then there's the whole issue of global harmonization, trying to make sure the rules are as consistent as possible across different countries.
Right, because a drug developed in one country might eventually be sold all over the world.
Precisely. And then there are all sorts of other challenges, like counterfeit drugs, which is a huge problem. People making and selling fake drugs that could be really dangerous. And then there's data integrity, making sure all the data submitted to regulatory agencies is accurate and reliable.
It's like a constant race to stay one step ahead of the bad guys.
In a way, yeah. But it's important work because ultimately it's about protecting people. And, the future of pharmaceutical regulation is exciting too. There's a lot of talk about using new technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning to help streamline the process and make it more efficient. And there's a growing emphasis on risk-based regulation, really focusing on the areas that pose the greatest risk to public health.
So it sounds like pharmaceutical regulation is this constantly evolving field that's trying to balance so many different factors: safety, innovation, globalization. It's a lot to juggle.
It definitely is. But, at the end of the day, it's all about making sure people have access to safe and effective medicines. And that's a pretty important goal, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It makes you realize how much we take for granted. When you go to the pharmacy and pick up a prescription, you just assume it's going to work and that it's safe. But there's this whole invisible world of regulations working behind the scenes to make sure that's true. It makes you wonder, though, how do we make sure all these safeguards don't end up slowing down the development of new treatments? It's a delicate balance for sure.